Hey guys, tonight we begin with a little exercise in gratitude. Because let's be honest, your thermostat probably isn't plotting your demise. So dim the lights, pull your blanket up, maybe pretend that fan is just a gentle medieval wind, and let's float ever so gently into a night where a cough could kill a family, and staying alive felt like low-stakes sorcery. Picture yourself in a one-room hut, mud-smeared walls that let in more wind than warmth, a hole in the roof doing its best to double as a chimney. Smoke doesn't gracefully waft out. It just hangs in awkward solidarity with your lungs. You didn't have to read a horror novel to feel unsettled. The air did that for you. Of course, there's no cozy fireplace mantle here. Nope, just a cold, sputtering pit in the middle of the floor, half-heartedly trying to be heat. You've got roughly 2 layers of rough-spun wool, possibly layered with more wool. Because why not double down? You're basically a walking onion of fabric. No fur collars or goose-down duvet. Just sheep stink and hope. Beds are sacks, stuffed with hay or rushes, maybe layered over the dirt floor, which radiates cold from below like a personal climate preference. Congrats, you're living the 3-dimensional cold assault. The best tool you've got, the hearth. It's smoky, it's inefficient, and yet survival hinges on it. You're banking embers overnight, because relighting means flint, steel, and prayers, and smoke, lots of smoke. Little surprise, it doubles as unintentional bug repellent. Who needs pest control when you're marinating in smoke 24/7? Let's drift over to another survival hack, indoor animals, because sharing your space with a cow is easier than freezing to death. Bessie is your hot water bottle, your body heat generator, and your roommate who isn't too keen on formalities. Pigs might get in the way at dinner time, and chickens might crow at ungodly hours. But their combined warmth, unequivocally life-saving. And beds. Beds? Not really. Straw-stuffed sacks that flatten into bust. Fleas, mold, maybe a surprise mouse. A morning rummage through bedding turned archaeology. Is that hay, or something that moved while you slept? Yet you cluster there, because that pile of plants is all that stands between you and frostbite. Next, let's talk breath, because, yep, how you inhale matters. Open-mouthed gasps bring icy air straight into your lungs. Shallow, calm, nasal breathing, slightly less suicidal. That's medieval survival breathing. Not dream-inducing exactly, but effective, so we'll take it. As the night drifts on, food becomes infrastructure. One-pot stews, turnips, parsnips, barley, maybe a smidgen of salted pork if you're lucky. Bulky, brown stew that sits in your gut like lava, radiating warmth as you doze. If you can spare it, toss in lard, slow-burning warmth like a belly bonfire. Before sleep, they had hay boxes. Yes, hay again, as medieval slow cookers and thermal insulation for food, and hot stones heated in the fire, wrapped in cloth, tucked into beds, medieval heating pads with a side of mild fire hazard. But oh, those stones under the hay, tiny miracles when frost is licking your spine. Let's float to housing ingenuity. Some homes were half underground. Think natural geothermal air conditioning. Others patched walls with mud, straw, even dung because Why not? Stuff any gap. Moss, rags, hair, anything to keep the cold ghosts out. Roofs layered with straw, turf, even grass roots. If that doesn't scream refined architecture, I don't know what does. Your winter arsenal. A heavy hardwood snow shovel. Because plastic hadn't been invented yet, and you've got real snow to move. Fur-lined wool socks. Sometimes fur from rabbits, sandwiched in between. Ouch, but warm. Mittens, stuffed with moss, feathers, even cat hair, if you're recycling creatively. Stick markers, painted with berry juice, to mark paths through drifts, your survival GPS. Socially, or anti-socially, you sleep in shifts. Someone tends the embers. Someone pretends not to know where their toes are. Kids as old as 4 help stoke. Grandparents stay up because lying down again is a small mountain climb. Sleep is broken, smoky, pressed against cow warmth. When dawn finally creeps in, if dawn even feels warm, you wake, still alive. Toasty? Not really, but breathing and passing on another night. One ember and one hairy, sock-sandaled foot at a time. And you know, when your blanket warms up later tonight, you'll drift to sleep thinking, this medieval peasant would snort in solidarity. But hey, they did more than snort. They survived. Ingenious, stubborn, earth-stuck survivors. So let's honor that with a gentle nod as we get sleepily transported into our own beds. So, we've made it through one medieval night without turning into a frozen turnip. But survival isn't just about blankets and cows. It's also about what you wrapped around yourself. Because fashion, believe it or not, was less about slaying on the runway and more about not actually dying. Picture a medieval peasant, wool tunic, wool hose, wool cloak, and, spoiler alert, more wool. If there was a sheep within 10 miles, you were basically wearing it. Sheep were your personal clothing department. Forget silk pajamas or fleece throws. Your pajamas were scratchy, slightly damp, and smelled faintly of whatever field you worked in last week. Romantic, right? Now, if you're imagining a crisp, freshly laundered outfits, pause. Medieval laundry was an event. Soap was rare, lye was harsh, and water wasn't always clean. So, people relied on layering, because if your under tunic smelled questionable, just throw another tunic on top. Problem solved. Well, not solved, just postponed. Basically, deodorant by suffocation. And winter layering wasn't light. We're talking up to 5 or 6 pieces, each heavier than the last. Cloaks lined with fur. Rabbit if you were poor. Squirrel if you were lucky. Ermine if you were royal enough to have your portrait painted. Even peasants had hoods with long tails, called liripipes, that doubled as scarves. Because why not wear your hoodie backwards if it keeps your ears attached? Shoes were another story. Leather boots, stuffed with moss, straw, or rags. Some had wooden pattens strapped under them, like medieval Crocs. Clunky, slippery, but hey, they kept your feet out of puddles. Socks, wool again, sometimes felted. Wool, sometimes fur. If you were desperate, yes, cat fur, because the cat wasn't going to keep you alive after it froze too. practical, if not exactly PETA approved. And speaking of warmth hacks, people actually lined clothing with straw. Like, literally, pack the inside with grass or rushes for insulation. You were basically turning yourself into a human scarecrow. Not glamorous, but probably better than hypothermia. Let's float over to the hygiene question. Because all these layers weren't exactly breathable. Bathing in winter? Rare. Water was icy, soap was expensive, and doctors were busy warning people that baths opened the pores and let diseases sneak in, which, scientifically speaking, is not how pores work. But medieval medicine wasn't exactly running peer-reviewed journals. So instead of bathing, peasants just shifted layers, replaced the inner tunic when it got crusty, maybe wash it in lye if you were feeling bold. Otherwise, smoke from the hearth doubled as deodorant. Everyone stank equally, so the smell kind of disappeared into the collective misery. Equal opportunity stink. Now, royalty had more options. They could afford linen undergarments, lighter, easier to wash, and slightly less itchy. They could change shirts often. Henry VIII, for example, was famously obsessive about his clean linens. Peasants, meanwhile, might have had one shirt total. If you ripped it, well, congratulations. Now you own a medieval crop top. And the ultimate survival fashion? Cloaks so wide they doubled as blankets. Imagine sleeping in your clothes, wrapping your cloak around the whole family, then waking up the next morning already dressed. Functional laziness, something we can all respect. But even with all these tricks, the cold was relentless. Fingers cracked, lips split, toes went numb, and frostbite wasn't poetic. It was deadly. Yet people endured. Wool, fur, straw, and shared warmth. Human survival stitched together in the simplest fabrics. Let's drift to the irony here. Today, wool coats are sold as luxury items. Hand-spun, artisan, high price tags. In the middle ages, wool was just life. Rough, greasy, practical, the exact thing you couldn't live without. It wasn't high fashion. It was the barrier between you and a slow, cold decline. So next time you complain that your winter jacket feels a bit bulky, just remember, you could be layering damp wool, moss-filled boots, and a hood that doubles as a leash. Stylish? Not really. Effective? Barely. But hey, it kept medieval peasants just warm enough to wake up and keep trudging through another icy dawn. And with that, let's float onto food. Because, spoiler alert, survival wasn't just about clothing layers. It was about calorie layers, too. And peasants had to eat strategically if they wanted their bodies to last through winter nights. All right, so we've wrapped ourselves in layers, avoided frostbite for a night or two, and maybe even survived the questionable indoor hygiene. But warmth isn't just fabric deep. It comes from within, literally. Enter food. Medieval peasants were calorie accountants by necessity. Every bite counted. Imagine a long winter evening. The hearth is barely glowing, smoke curling lazily toward the hole in the roof. You're hunched over a pot, and no, it's not a cozy stew simmering with exotic spices. It's brown, thick, occasionally lumpy porridge, barley, oats, maybe a few root vegetables if you were lucky. If you had meat, It was probably salted or smoked last harvest. Fresh meat in winter, dream on. Now, they had one-pot meals for multiple reasons. Economical, easy to stir while you're fighting off cold, and crucially, to make that one pot last for days. Reheating was more of a necessity than a choice. Heat, calories, survival. People were practical like that. And yes, ale counts as calories. Think of it as medieval Gatorade meets liquid bread. It wasn't always strong. Some of it tasted like wet hay, but warmth in a mug? Guaranteed. Not just psychological. Alcohol does make you feel warmer, briefly, which was useful if you were outside chopping wood or trudging through snow. Of course, it didn't replace wool or fur. No miracle here. Bread was another staple. Dense, chewy, often baked from rye or barley. White wheat bread? Luxury item, reserved for lords and the occasional festive feast. Peasants' bread was sturdy, filling, and probably tried to grow back into a tree if left alone long enough. But calories in, survival probability up. Let's talk rationing. Food was seasonal, and storage methods rudimentary. Vegetables stored in root cellars, often just pits in the ground, lined with straw. Apples, turnips, carrots, buried to avoid freezing. If a loaf of bread got moldy, it could be salvaged by scraping the top. Survival innovation at its finest, or grossest, depending on your perspective. Water wasn't ideal either. Rivers and wells might be frozen. Drinking cold water? Sure, if you wanted a bonus of hypothermia. So, people often drank ale or weekly fermented drinks, which killed germs better than modern bottled water. It's ironic. Your local tavern was safer than a stream. Breakfast was often leftovers, reheated porridge, maybe stale bread, softened in hot water. Lunch? One pot stew if you were lucky. And dinner? Whatever was left, or a repeat of lunch. High culinary variety wasn't a priority, when staying alive was the main course. And let's not forget fasting rules. Church-mandated fasts were everywhere. Fish instead of meat, because medieval ecclesiastical authorities decided that abstaining from calories in the dead of winter somehow pleased God. A tough gig for survival. But peasants adapted. Fish stews, salted herring, or just very thin broth. Survival, creativity, level expert. Another life hack, communal meals. Neighbors might pool resources for a shared stew, sharing heat, sharing calories. It was practical, but also social. One person cooks, everyone eats. Reduces fuel and firewood usage. Double bonus, you stay warmer because there's more body heat in the hut. And finally, fewer hungry arguments over who gets the last turnip. And speaking of fuel, calories, literal warmth. You eat, your body metabolizes, your blood warms. Sleep better if your belly isn't gnawing at itself. Medieval peasants knew this instinctively. One too small meal, freezing toes, and shallow breaths all night. Full belly, slightly less miserable. Let's drift into night snacks, or what passed as them. Maybe roasted chestnuts by the hearth. Maybe a tiny piece of leftover bread. Hot water poured over stale porridge for a midnight snack. Comfort food before sleeping in damp hay. You might not call it luxury, but when frost is gnawing at your ankles, it tastes like heaven. Finally, consider the psychological factor. Food was not just fuel. Preparing the pot, stirring it, watching it slowly cook over embers, smelling that earthy aroma, that was calm, meditative, almost bedtime ritual-like. Even in hardship, there was a rhythm to survival. One spoonful at a time, one night, survived at a time. And as you drift off after eating, tiny bits of ale warming your belly, bread sticking pleasantly in your teeth, you can imagine medieval peasants doing the same. Not glamorous, not Instagram-worthy, just alive, slightly warm, ready to face another long, cold night. So, we've eaten, layered ourselves like woolly onions, and survived the bitterest part of the day. Still awake, still human. Now comes the main event, sleep. But sleep wasn't just horizontal rest. It was a tactical operation, a dance of warmth, smoke, and human ingenuity. Picture this. The hut's single fire pit is sputtering. Embers glow like tiny orange eyes, threatening to die out if neglected. Someone, probably the oldest capable person or the one with nerves of steel, remains awake, poking, coaxing, whispering encouragement to the fire. Fire is life. Without it, you become a frozen sculpture in straw. Beds were humble, minimalistic, and communal. Straw sacks or rush-filled mats on the floor. Some huts had raised platforms, a sort of medieval bunk bed, while others just flattened hay on the mud floor. And yes, animals were welcome. Cows, pigs, chickens, sometimes even a dog or two, not for cuddles. Heat, survival. A barnyard sauna, basically. Sleeping arrangements were strategic. Families huddled, adults on the perimeter, children in the center. You wanted the little ones warm, the adults willing to sacrifice their toes to frost if necessary. The huddling wasn't just comforting. It was thermal physics in action. Body heat transfer. Medieval edition. Clothing stayed on. Hats, woolen mittens, multiple tunics. Cold air sneaks in from holes in walls and roofs. But layers and human proximity keep it manageable. You breathe through your nose. You cover your face. You hope the smoke doesn't make you cough, because coughing equals oxygen loss, equals regret. Let's talk smoke. Fire pits and mud huts were smoky, not atmospheric in a cozy candlelit way. Smoke filled the room, curling toward the roof. A constant companion. It irritated eyes, made noses run, and yet it doubled as insect repellent. Fleas, lice, mosquitoes, all kept at bay by your own personal cloud of haze. Multitasking at its finest, and the ritual of ember tending is fascinating. You couldn't just collapse into bed and forget the fire. Someone had to poke, shift, and adjust wood or coal. This was often the last family member awake, staring into the flickering glow, feeling oddly like a medieval fire priest, guardian of warmth. If embers died too early, the hut would wake with frost on the blankets and a chorus of shivering. Huddling with animals introduced its own complications. Cows occupy space. Pigs snore. Chickens might try to perch on your chest. But warmth trumps annoyance. Fur-on-fur heat exchange. Effective, if slightly itchy. And in the absence of central heating, Your barnyard buddies were survival tech. Noise was minimal. No street sounds, no radios, no lullabies. Just the occasional animal groan, the fire crackle, the muffled cough from a sibling. Sleep was more about conservation, energy, warmth, survival, than dreams or comfort. And yet, there was routine. Everyone knew bedtime sequences: ember tending, straw fluffed, hay arranged, children nestled, animals positioned strategically. Adults often stayed semi-awake, shifting in straw piles, ensuring the fire didn't die. Sleep was intermittent, dreamy, sometimes, functional, always. If a cold snap hit, people took additional measures. Hot stones wrapped in cloth, tucked under blankets, medieval heating pads, stones reheated during the night, rotated like tiny sun replacements. Ingenious, dangerous, slightly, but you'd rather risk a minor burn than freeze to death. Hygiene in sleep? Non-existent. Wool layers, damp air, animals nearby. Medieval aromatherapy at its most authentic. Fleas and lice were ignored unless unbearable. The idea of nightly showers was a fantasy. Survival over cleanliness, always. And the dawn? You woke stiff, slightly smoky, but alive. Fingers and toes might be numb, but embers still smoldered, animals still warm. Breakfast was next, layering calories back into your system. Life continued. Another night survived. Another day facing mud, cold, and chores. The ironic contrast. Today, we complain about 65-degree bedrooms, mismatched blankets, or sleeping with a slightly loud partner. Peasants of the Middle Ages would snort in solidarity. They had cold, smoke, fleas, crowded bedding, and shared animals. But they also had strategies, rituals, and a stubborn will to survive. That's the lesson of the medieval sleep. It wasn't luxury, it wasn't comfort, but it was effective. And as you settle into your modern bed, dim the lights, and listen to this story, you can imagine their tiny victories, their layered bodies, their ember-watching rituals. A warm blanket in 2025 feels like magic when compared to hay, fire, and a cow snuggled at your side. So, we've survived night after night, huddled in straw, cloaked in layers, sharing body heat with your barnyard pals, and nibbling on whatever calories you could scrounge. But medieval survival wasn't a solo endeavor. It thrived on community. And no, not the Instagram kind. Real, messy, cooperative, slightly smelly human networks. A medieval village was a living organism. Everyone had a role. Children helped gather firewood or feed animals. Adults labored in the fields or tended to livestock. Elders passed down knowledge, like the precise angle to poke embers so your fire wouldn't die midnight, or how to stretch a single loaf of bread for 3 meals. Knowledge was survival currency. Work began early, very early. Imagine a rooster, real ones, not alarm clocks, announcing 4 or 5 a.m., sometimes before. You woke, layered on wool, and trudged into icy fields. Tasks were dictated by season: sowing, reaping, tending, fixing. The cold didn't care if you were tired or grumpy. The frost was the boss, and it didn't negotiate. Social structures reinforced survival. Families weren't just units. They were teams. Neighboring families shared tools, exchanged firewood, or helped repair a roof blown apart by a winter storm. Social capital was as important as calories. Someone with extra hay might trade for a turn of the communal mill. Everyone depended on everyone else, whether they liked it or not. And speaking of tools, these weren't shiny, ergonomic, or OSHA approved. Wooden plows, flint axes, rudimentary sickles, blunt, heavy, inefficient. Using them required strategy and stamina, and the occasional whispered curse word. A misstep could mean a broken tool or a smashed thumb, but mistakes were tolerated because trial and error was cheaper than death. Let's float to village routines. Markets, if weather allowed, were small, informal. You traded vegetables, eggs, or the occasional preserved meat. Fun fact, barter ruled because currency wasn't as common among peasants. One chicken for a sack of oats, one woven basket for a portion of cheese. Survival economy. Simple, pragmatic, and occasionally awkward when someone miscounted the eggs. Religion was intertwined with daily life. Church bells marked not just prayers, but schedules. Feast days provided rare indulgences. Fast days enforced minimal calorie intake. And all along, superstition threaded through tasks. A charm for the hearth, a prayer for livestock, a whisper to ward off evil spirits. Psychology as practical as theology. And yes, emergencies happened. Crops failed. Livestock died. Illnesses spread. Communities pooled resources. Shared knowledge included remedies, boiled herbs, poultices, and occasionally bloodletting if the local barber surgeon had a day off. The collective experience of centuries guided decisions. You learned to survive by observing, imitating, and praying silently when the frost tried to claim your toes. Even leisure had a survival angle. Storytelling, singing, or spinning yarn, activities that seem quaint, helped pass time during long winter nights. They reinforced bonds, transmitted culture, and distracted from hunger pangs. If laughter broke out, it was gentle, brief, practical. Not a sitcom-level explosion. Humor was a warm blanket for the mind. Community work also included mutual defense. Bandits, wolves, and other threats existed. Villagers shared watch duties. One person tended fire, another patrolled. Children might be involved in alerting neighbors. Not exactly knightly, but practical. Survival required cooperation on every front. And finally, let's consider endurance. Peasants rose before sunrise, worked through frost and snow, ate, slept in layers, maintained embers, and repeated, season after season, year after year. Their strategy was consistency, not glamour, not comfort, but survival. And somehow, despite mud, frost, and feasts limited to special days, communities endured. By modern standards, this life seems grueling, harsh, and maybe slightly sadistic. But for medieval peasants, it was just life. Tools, food, community, fire, and layered clothing. They weren't luxuries, they were lifelines. And through the haze of smoke, mud, and frost, people lived, worked, and prepared for another night. And as we float back to our cozy modern beds, It's comforting, in a way, to imagine their tiny victories. Another ember kept alive, another loaf stretched across meals, another night survived with frostbitten toes, but a pulse. The medieval world was cold, smoky, crowded, and relentless. But humanity adapted, and that's the story of survival, the art of making it through another night. So, we've talked about layers, food, community, and the art of surviving cold nights. But medieval life wasn't just endless frost and smoky huts. Every so often, peasants had little hacks, small joys, and rare indulgences that made the harsh winter a bit more bearable. Let's float first to the ingenious survival tricks. Hay boxes, for example, were a game changer. Imagine a large wooden box stuffed with hay, in which a pot of stew or porridge could slowly cook for hours, even overnight, without additional fire. It's basically a medieval slow cooker. You put the pot in, covered it with straw, and let residual heat do the magic. By morning, the stew was ready to warm bellies and souls. Ingenious, if slightly crunchy from stray hay bits. Then there were hot stones, wrapped in cloth, heated in the fire, tucked under beds or blankets. They radiated warmth slowly, almost like a medieval electric blanket, but without electricity and with a moderate risk of burning your toes. People learned the art of rotating stones during the night to keep beds consistently warm. Practical, tactile, and slightly magical in effect. Peasants also had seasonal comforts. Winter festivals, Christmas, Yule, or harvest celebrations offered brief respites. Ale flowed a bit more generously. Food was slightly richer, and decorations, if they could be called that, brought a small sparkle of joy. Community gatherings meant storytelling, singing, dancing, barely enough to raise heart rates, but enough to remind people that life had texture beyond frost and mud. And speaking of small pleasures, consider the luxury of extra food, maybe a rare piece of cheese, a handful of nuts, or preserved fruit. These were treats, often rationed or reserved for children. The taste of sweetness, once in a while, was enough to boost morale and give the cold night a bit of color, a subtle, psychological warmth to accompany physical warmth. Pets and barnyard animals played double roles, warmth providers and minor entertainment. A cow lying beside you was not just heat. Its presence created a rhythm, a gentle breathing pattern that could lull humans into semi-conscious sleep. Chickens moving around added unpredictable movement, forcing you to adapt. Alertness as survival training, disguised as life. And for those extremely creative souls, mud and straw offered insulation beyond walls and clothing. People would patch gaps in walls, create makeshift windbreaks, and even craft rudimentary mats to sit or sleep on. Improvised survival engineering. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't Pinterest-worthy, but it worked. Let's drift over to hygiene. Luxuries. Winter baths were rare, but steam from cooking fires sometimes provided warmth for light washing, or an occasional visit to a river if one dared. Herbs were used to scent clothing or bedding, lavender, rosemary, or dried flowers tucked into pillows. Tiny moments of comfort amidst the grim, smoky routine, and the ultimate luxury, rest. A rare night when fire maintenance was minimal, children were calm, and frost held off. Peasants treasured these nights. Sleep became almost indulgent, an unbroken stretch of warmth. Embers glowing softly, hay piles at their peak fluffiness. These nights were tiny victories, proof that life could occasionally be pleasant, even in hardship. Ironically, modern readers might underestimate these small comforts. A medieval festival, a hot stone, a shared stew, trivial by today's standards. But for peasants, they were lifelines, moments where survival felt less like a grind and more like life. And of course, there was humor, the quiet, ironic kind, stories passed down, jokes about frost-bitten toes, or sheep eating the neighbor's straw. Humor wasn't loud or boisterous. It was whispered, shared, subtle, like the smoke curling from the fire. Gentle laughter that warmed hearts when nothing else could. So, as we float through these details, it's clear. Survival wasn't just endurance. It was creativity, cooperation, and occasional joy. Hay boxes, hot stones, festivals, herbs, shared meals. They stitched warmth, both physical and emotional, into the cold medieval tapestry. And as you settle deeper under your blanket tonight, you can imagine yourself in that smoky hut, cozy in layers, smelling herbs, hearing animals, tasting a rare treat, laughing softly with neighbors. A world harsh, yes, but punctuated by ingenuity and small pleasures, little victories against frost, hunger, and fatigue. So, we've covered layers, food, fires, community, and rare comforts. But survival wasn't static. Seasons ruled medieval life with a kind of brutal predictability. Winter was the grand tyrant, long, dark, cold, and everyone adjusted, consciously or not, to the rhythm of the year. Peasants measured time not by calendars or clocks, but by sunlight, frost, and agricultural cycles. The year began in rhythm with the land, plowing, sowing, tending, harvesting. Winter was downtime in the fields, but downtime didn't mean idleness. It meant preparation, repair, and survival planning. That meant chopping wood in chunks that could last until spring, mending clothing, reinforcing walls, and preserving food. Seasonal foresight was as crucial as calorie counting. And let's talk darkness. Winter days were short, sometimes as little as 8 hours of weak, pale sunlight. That means work often began in twilight and ended in near darkness. Tasks like tending fires, feeding animals, and household chores were done under dim light from hearths or rush torches. Eyes strained. Mistakes happened, yet people adapted. Night vision was a skill. You learned to navigate by memory and instinct, moving like a shadow in your own home. Cold and scarcity amplified mental strain. The body survived on calories, but the mind battled monotony, fear, and uncertainty. Hunger wasn't constant, but it lingered in the background, a gnawing reminder that one bad harvest or illness could tip the scales toward tragedy. Psychological resilience became a survival skill. People relied on routine, community, faith, and humor to maintain it. One way they coped: structured daily routines. Even when there was little to do, tasks were scheduled. Sweep the floor, repair, tools, stoke the fire, tend the animals, prepare meals. Purpose, however mundane, anchored minds. Chaos was dangerous. Predictable routines were survival strategies. Let's drift over to mental comfort from social cohesion. Gossip, storytelling, and simple chatter weren't frivolous. They reinforced bonds, transmitted crucial knowledge, and distracted from hardships. Did you hear about Farmer Giles's frostbitten goat? Might sound trivial, but shared narratives reminded everyone, you're not alone, and life goes on. Humor, subtle as smoke curling from the hearth, was essential mental sustenance. Winter festivals offered psychological respite, too. They punctuated long, dark months with community events, singing, dancing, modest feasts, all brief, but vital mental boosts. These festivals reminded peasants that existence wasn't only about survival. It had rhythm, ritual, and occasionally, delight. Sleep itself contributed to mental resilience, despite cold, smoke, and crowded bedding, huddling in layers, sharing warmth, and maintaining ember rituals created predictable patterns. These patterns reduced anxiety. Routine sleep, however broken, was a stabilizing factor, a medieval version of mindfulness. Now, scarcity bred creativity, clothing repairs with mismatched fabrics, leftover scraps transformed into stuffing for beds, improvisation in cooking. All these practices weren't just practical, they were mentally comforting, proof that you could control small parts of a harsh world. Agency, however limited, was a powerful balm. And remember the mental toll of uncertainty. Illnesses, frostbite, or crop failure were constant threats. People coped through faith, superstition, and pragmatic problem-solving. Prayers, charms, and ritualized routines weren't mere superstition. They were ways to reduce cognitive stress, create a sense of predictability in chaos. Even boredom served a purpose. Long winter nights forced introspection, skill honing, and observation. Peasants learned from repeated mistakes, memorized survival hacks, and taught children through demonstration. Monotony, in a strange way, reinforced competence. By the end of winter, when first signs of thaw appeared, survival had been achieved yet again. Bodies were frost-worn but alive. Minds were practiced in patience, endurance, and subtle joy. The first thaw was as much a psychological victory as a physical one, a promise of renewal, work in the fields, and slightly more freedom from frost. And as you listen tonight, wrapped in a modern blanket with constant heat and soft lighting, imagine that resilience. Long nights, tiny comforts, shared warmth, purpose, and humor. They were the mental scaffolding, keeping medieval peasants alive through the harshest months. Survival wasn't just physical. It was cognitive, emotional, and social. In essence, winter forged skill, patience, and quiet ingenuity. And in that way, even the darkest, coldest nights had a kind of rhythm, a structure, and for those who endured, a profound, if understated, beauty. All right, so we've floated through daily survival, seasonal cycles, and mental resilience. But let's not sugarcoat medieval life. Sometimes chaos barged in uninvited, and chaos had a name. Extreme weather, sudden illness, and crop failures. First, weather. Not just cold, but blizzards, freezing rain, and unexpected storms. Imagine waking to a snowdrift blocking your door, your hay soaked, your fire nearly drowned, roads vanished under ice, animals panicked, tools froze solid. Survival required constant vigilance, adaptability, and a healthy sense of resignation. You learned that snow wasn't decorative. It was a tiny tyrant. And then there were floods. Mud huts weren't exactly waterproof. Rain might seep through roofs. Floors became quagmires. And fires threatened to go out just when you needed warmth most. Layering your clothing now had another function: insulation against accidental indoor rainfall. Practicality was everything. Next, illness. Plagues weren't just historical headlines. They were personal. One cough could ripple through a family or a village faster than rumors. Common ailments, often untreated, could weaken a peasant, making frostbite, hunger, and exhaustion worse. People relied on rudimentary medicine, herbs, poultices, prayers, and a lot of luck. Modern antibiotics? Non-existent. Your immune system was basically your co-worker and your roommate. Nutrition shortages compounded these risks. Crop failures due to drought, frost, or pests meant weeks or months of rationing. Bread turned harder, soups thinner, and ale watered down. People learned to be frugal to the point of artistry. A potato peel here, a leftover root there. Each morsel counted. Calories weren't just energy. They were armor against winter and disease. And let's talk surprise storms, hail, windstorms, sudden freezes. Peasant huts weren't fortified. Roofs leaked. Walls shook. Fires almost went out. People improvised, patching holes with straw, reinforcing doors with wooden beams, even forming human chains to move supplies from flooded areas. Teamwork was survival. Chaos rewarded creativity. Now, pests, fleas, lice, rodents, they were everywhere. Animals brought warmth, but also fleas. Grain stores attracted mice. Contamination was constant. Peasants tolerated discomfort for survival. Modern readers might squirm, but at the time, scratching was less dangerous than starvation or hypothermia. Adaptation, not comfort, ruled. And there were rare tragedies too. Fires consuming huts, barns collapsing under snow, livestock freezing or succumbing to disease. Villagers learned communal responses, bucket brigades, shared barns, collective farming for future security. Everyone had to pitch in, whether they wanted to or not. Individual survival depended on collective effort. Psychologically, unpredictability demanded resilience. You couldn't predict frost, disease, or sudden storms, but you could predict yourself, how you reacted, how you preserved resources, how you relied on community knowledge. Routine, ritual, and preparation were the antidotes to anxiety. Humor remained a subtle shield. Tiny jokes about snow ruining boots, sheep escaping through a frozen fence, or the neighbor's cat refusing to share warmth. Even children were inducted into this survival education early. They learned to anticipate hazards, contribute to work, and tolerate discomfort. Play, oddly enough, became rehearsal. Games involving balance, carrying heavy objects, or predicting weather built skills vital for survival. Childhood was training, disguised as fun, and despite all these hardships, there was continuity. Seasons repeated, storms passed, fires were rekindled, food stretched as creatively as possible. Communities endured. Each winter night survived. Each disease evaded. Each storm weathered became another testament to the quiet endurance of human beings. Finally, perspective. As we float back to our comfortable modern beds, imagine medieval peasants enduring snow, frost, illness, and hunger, not with despair, but with incremental, ingenious survival strategies. Every hardship was a lesson, every calm night a victory, and every small comfort, hay-stuffed beds, hot stones, shared stews, was celebrated because life in the Middle Ages was harsh, unpredictable, and yet remarkably persistent. So, we've survived nights, storms, plagues, and frostbite. But survival wasn't just about food, warmth, or avoiding hypothermia. It revolved around family. Peasant life was fundamentally communal, and the family was the smallest, most essential unit of survival. Children were integral, not optional. They weren't just cute distractions. They were laborers in training. Toddlers might start with small chores, feeding chickens, fetching water, helping with firewood. By age 5 or 6, they could carry more substantial loads, learn basic farming tasks, or assist in food preparation. Play was blended with training. Games simulated survival, balancing on logs, carrying small baskets, predicting weather, learning through doing. Because schooling was rare and survival was hands-on. Parents weren't just caregivers, they were teachers, passing down essential knowledge: how to stoke an ember without extinguishing it, which herbs cured minor ailments, how to stretch a loaf of bread over 3 meals, the secret to storing root vegetables without freezing. These were practical, life-saving lessons, often imparted in whispers during long winter nights. While everyone huddled together, family life had structure, almost ritualistic in rhythm. Morning chores, meals, work in the fields, tending animals, evening routines, huddling by the fire, storytelling, and finally sleep. Within this repetitive cadence, children absorbed everything: observation, imitation, and gentle instruction shaped competence. Mistakes were tolerated but corrected. Experience was the ultimate teacher. Emotionally, the family was a support network. Despite harsh living conditions, shared hardships built deep bonds. Siblings huddled together for warmth. Parents shared responsibility and burdens. Even the smallest acts, reaching for a shared blanket, offering a scrap of food, reinforced trust and mutual dependence. Psychological survival was as important as physical survival. Marriage and household structure also played a role. Peasant marriages were practical, often arranged for alliance, labor distribution, or property management. Love might develop later, but initially, survival dictated household composition. Extended family members often lived together or nearby, further strengthening communal safety nets. Intergenerational knowledge went beyond survival hacks. Stories, songs, and local lore were transmitted alongside practical skills. Tales of previous winters, unusual weather patterns, or disease outbreaks served as cautionary guides. Humor and folklore lightened the harsh realities of life, while subtly educating younger generations. The art of storytelling wasn't just entertainment, it was a survival tool. Children learned to navigate hierarchy too. Respect for elders, adherence to routines, and collaborative work were instilled early. Authority wasn't optional. It was part of a system that ensured everyone contributed and survived. Discipline was practical, often strict, but fundamentally rooted in life or death necessity rather than cruelty. Daily routines doubled as teaching moments. Harvesting vegetables, tending animals, repairing roofs, baking bread. Every action was layered with instruction. Children absorbed not just the how, but the why. Why a fire must never be left unattended. Why straw must be fluffed nightly. Why frost could be deadly if underestimated. Knowledge was inseparable from practice, and let's float over to small joys. Despite hardships, families celebrated minor victories. A child learning a new skill correctly, a roof repaired before the first snow, a pot of stew successfully stretched through the week. These moments reinforced competence, resilience, and morale. Celebration didn't need extravagance, just acknowledgement and shared pride. Even in scarcity, love and care manifested. Parents shared warmth, comforted children during storms, whispered stories by firelight. These quiet, intimate moments provided psychological sustenance, a buffer against the relentless physical challenges of medieval peasant life. By the time children reached adolescence, they were competent, aware, and prepared to eventually manage households or work independently. Knowledge, endurance, and subtle social skills had been carefully imparted over years of repetitive, shared daily life, and the cycle continued, each generation quietly teaching the next, ensuring continuity and survival. So, as you lie back tonight, warm, fed, and safe, imagine a medieval family tucked into straw-filled beds, children learning by observation, parents sharing warmth and wisdom, animals providing heat, and stories weaving knowledge and comfort into the cold night. Family was the hearth beyond the fire, the central anchor of survival, learning, and resilience. So, we've survived daily routines, seasonal cycles, storms, plagues, and learned about family life. But medieval peasants didn't just survive. One winter, they planned for years of hardship. Survival wasn't reactive, it was proactive. Every task had foresight embedded. Every decision was a hedge against scarcity. Storage was everything. Grain, root vegetables, salted meat, and preserved legumes formed the backbone of long-term survival. Granaries, root cellars, and straw-insulated pits were designed to protect food from frost, pests, and mold. This wasn't casual hoarding. Every kernel counted. A miscalculation could mean hunger stretching for weeks or even months. Root vegetables, carrots, turnips, parsnips were particularly valuable. Dug before the frost, stored in straw-lined pits, they could last through winter if properly insulated. Herbs and dried fruits were stored carefully, both for nutrition and medicinal purposes. Peasants developed a practical understanding of decomposition, moisture control, and airflow, rudimentary science born from necessity. Salted meat and fish were also crucial. Salting, smoking, and drying were techniques learned through trial, error, and tradition. These foods offered vital protein during lean months. Preservation wasn't just about flavor. It was survival insurance. And let's not forget grains. Flour, oats, barley. They were the lifeblood of medieval diets. Storing them required vigilance. Rodents were relentless. Moisture was a constant threat, and spoilage could devastate a household. Communities often shared storage strategies, pooling knowledge to ensure everyone survived the long winter. Collaboration, even in mundane logistics, was vital. Planning extended beyond food. Tools were maintained meticulously. Blunt plows, cracked axes, and worn sickles were repaired or replaced during off-seasons. Clothing was patched, layered, and sometimes re-engineered to endure years of use. Even wood for fire, cut, stacked, and seasoned, was part of strategic foresight. Peasants also anticipated disasters, unpredictable weather, crop failures, and disease outbreaks required contingency plans, extra rations, communal grain stores, and flexible labor divisions were standard strategies. Survival was never about excess. It was about having just enough, plus a margin for the unexpected. Weaving into this practical foresight was an almost ritualized rhythm. Tasks were scheduled by season, not convenience. Spring sowing dictated winter repairs. Autumn harvest dictated storage strategies. Each task was linked to another, forming a cycle that reinforced survival knowledge across generations. Economy played a role too. Barter systems, trade with neighboring villages, and even informal lending ensured resources could stretch farther. Peasants knew when to trade surplus, when to conserve, and how to leverage community relationships. Survival was both material and social. And here's the subtle, psychological aspect. Knowing you had planned and stored effectively gave peace of mind. Even in a harsh winter, with frost biting and hunger lingering, the confidence that food, fire, and essentials were secured was a mental buffer. Routine and foresight reduced anxiety, much like modern planning for emergencies. Education, again, was intertwined. Children learned not just immediate survival skills, but also the logic behind storage, rationing, and preparation. Lessons were imparted casually, through repetition and observation, so that by adulthood, survival knowledge was almost instinctual. Humor and morale remained essential. Storytelling, lighthearted gossip, and shared laughter persisted even during storage or maintenance tasks. A joke about the neighbor miscounting turnips or a chicken getting stuck in the root cellar kept spirits up. Emotional endurance was just as critical as physical endurance. By the end of winter, if all plans succeeded, food stored, tools repaired, clothing mended, peasants had survived another season. But they never relaxed fully. Foresight was ongoing. Lessons learned fed the next year's plans. Strategy, memory, and community knowledge formed a feedback loop, ensuring survival not just of individuals, but of the village as a whole. So, as you settle into a warm modern bed tonight, you can imagine medieval peasants carefully stacking root vegetables, checking grain stores, rotating salted meat, patching clothes, and planning their next steps. Their lives were harsh, yes, but threaded with ingenuity, foresight, and quiet resilience, a testament to human adaptation and endurance. So, we've trudged through freezing nights, storms, scarcity, plagues, and endless labor, but eventually, the calendar, or more accurately, the sun, began to shift. Days lengthened, frost receded, snow melted, the medieval world stirred awake, and peasants had reason to reflect on their survival. End of winter wasn't just about thawing fields. It was a psychological milestone. The last weeks of winter tested endurance, planning, and communal cooperation. Now, with the sun returning, villagers took stock, grain stores checked, livestock assessed, tools and firewood evaluated. Every detail mattered, because winter had taught lessons, both harsh and subtle, that shaped the year ahead. Reflection was quietly profound. Surviving another season was a victory, even if invisible to outsiders. Frostbite, illness, hunger, and accidents hadn't claimed you, or at least your immediate family. That endurance reinforced competence, confidence, and social cohesion. Survival was tangible, almost sacred. Small victories, like preserving root vegetables or maintaining embers through a blizzard, were celebrated privately, often with a shared smile or a nod. Communities also recognized renewal collectively. Rituals, feasts, and festivals marked the changing season. Lent, early Easter, or local spring festivals offered opportunities for gratitude, social bonding, and cautious celebration. Ale flowed a little freer, meals were slightly richer, and dancing reminded everyone that life wasn't just survival. It had rhythm, continuity, and even joy. Children, of course, were keenly aware of the change. Snow patches melted into mud, puddles. Games shifted from indoor chores to outdoor exploration. Lessons continued, but the world offered new challenges. Navigating melting rivers, plowing thawed soil, or tending to livestock that had survived the cold. Experience and observation remained the central teaching tools. Preparation for spring was almost immediate. Fields needed plowing, seeds sowing, and tools repairing. Winter storage was partially dismantled. Excess hay, straw, and wood redistributed. Livestock that had been confined indoors returned to pastures. Life regained motion, but it required careful attention. Renewal wasn't just joyous, it was strategic. Reflection also included storytelling. Tales of the harsh winter were recounted, highlighting mistakes, successes, and oddities. Remember when the goat refused to sleep inside? Or when the frost killed 3 cabbages, but spared the turnips? Humor, even in recollection, reinforced social cohesion and collective memory. Mistakes and successes alike were recorded orally, feeding next year's survival strategies. And psychologically, the first thaw brought subtle relief. Anxiety eased. The mind, previously focused on rationing, warmth, and vigilance, could relax incrementally. Yet mindfulness remained. The winter had shown that complacency was dangerous. Observation, careful planning, and community awareness continued to be vital. Even minor luxuries were savored. Early spring herbs, first fresh water from melting snow, or a slightly richer stew were tiny rewards. Peasants understood that comfort was provisional, fleeting, but meaningful. Appreciation for small pleasures, the taste of slightly sweetened bread, the smell of damp soil, the warmth of the sun, was heightened by months of deprivation. Communal resilience, passed from generation to generation, became apparent. Children, now slightly older, absorbed lessons about enduring scarcity, anticipating crises, and contributing to both work and social cohesion. Every survival strategy learned in winter had practical application in spring and summer, reinforcing the continuity of peasant life. By the time planting began in earnest, medieval peasants had not only survived, they had adapted, learned, and reflected. They understood limits, leveraged ingenuity, and celebrated endurance. Seasonal renewal wasn't just physical, it was psychological and social. It reinforced identity, cohesion, and the quiet pride of surviving nature's relentless cycles. So, as you sink further into your modern, comfortable bed tonight, picture a medieval village emerging from winter. Smoke curls from chimneys. Children run cautiously over melting snow. Families sort grain, repair tools, and prepare for planting. The frost recedes, and the world hints at color, warmth, and possibility again. Survival continues, yes, but so does adaptation, reflection, and the subtle, enduring triumph of human resilience. So, we floated through cold nights, harsh storms, scarcity, plagues, family life, storage, and seasonal renewal. We've seen medieval peasants survive, adapt, and even find tiny joys in a world that demanded constant vigilance. And now, as we gently drift toward the end of our story, it's worth reflecting, not just on them, but on us. Modern life is dramatically different, isn't it? Central heating, abundant food, instant communication, and comfortable beds. Yet, the essence of survival, endurance, and adaptation still resonates, just in subtler ways. We may not fear frostbite or famine, but we deal with stress, deadlines, illness, and uncertainty. The mental lessons of medieval peasants, routine, foresight, humor, community, and observation, still apply. Let's start with routine. Medieval life thrived on repetition and predictable patterns. Chores, meals, and rituals anchored minds and bodies. In our modern chaos, we can borrow that rhythm. Small routines, morning rituals, evening wind downs, meal prep, anchor the day, reducing stress and creating a sense of control. Foresight, too, remains relevant. Peasants meticulously planned for months ahead. Food storage, tool maintenance, winter preparedness. Today, planning budgets, meals, work schedules, or even downtime mirrors this foresight. Anticipation isn't just practical, it's psychologically stabilizing. Knowing we have contingencies in place is surprisingly comforting. Humor, subtle and resilient, is timeless. Medieval peasants laughed quietly at frostbitten toes, misbehaving animals, or failed harvests. Our modern equivalent, laughing at minor mishaps, awkward Zoom calls, or burnt dinners. Humor lightens the mental load, provides perspective, and strengthens social bonds. Community remains central. Villages survived by pooling labor, sharing knowledge, and supporting one another. Today, our village might be friends, family, or colleagues, but the principle is the same. Cooperation, shared burdens, and mutual encouragement reduce stress and reinforce resilience. Observation and learning, too, are evergreen. Medieval children absorbed survival skills by watching and doing. We absorb knowledge through experience, mistakes, and mentorship. Patience, repetition, and mindful attention remain key to mastering life's challenges. And finally, small pleasures matter. Hot stones, hay beds, shared stews, and festivals provided warmth, joy, and hope amidst hardship. In modern life, small joys like a warm cup of tea, a good book, a walk outside, or a favorite song carry similar weight. They remind us that life isn't only about survival, it's about savoring fleeting moments of comfort, connection, and delight. So tonight, as you lie back, eyes closed, headphones on, and mind ready to float into sleep, imagine medieval peasants enduring long, harsh nights, and see yourself benefiting from their quiet wisdom. Let their creativity, patience, and subtle humor inspire a sense of calm and resilience within you. The lesson is simple. Life is unpredictable. Challenges are inevitable. But preparation, routine, community, humor, and appreciation of small comforts create both survival and satisfaction. Medieval peasants mastered it out of necessity. We can borrow it voluntarily, with far less frostbite. And as you drift further into sleep, carry that thought. Resilience is timeless, adaptation is universal, and comfort, small, mindful, and intentional, is always within reach. Good night, and may your dreams be warm, gentle, and just a little wiser than yesterday.